That's the 90s hit Being Boring by the Pet Shop Boys. Supposedly, Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe met in the bar in the Architectural Association and formed their band. This kind of early 80s, about the same time tonight's speaker dropped by the AA to attend some evening lectures by the likes of Mark Cousins and others. Can you imagine the shift in school culture if you had a bar in the middle of Milstein Plate? I can. This evening's lecture by Patrick Schumacher will, I'm sure, focus on practice and design philosophy, where Patrick sees his past and his future, and that's as it should be. And I could rehearse his lengthy and impressive curriculum vitae. I could name the international award-winning commissions he's had, including the Sterling Prize or several books. I could mention the boards of architectural journals he serves on. I might note his office of 400 with new satellites in New York City and Mexico City going up. I could speak to the interesting juxtaposition of a lecture on parametricism to be offered in the still beating heart of formalism here at Cornell. But I feel, given that this is a place of education, that in my limited time at this lectern, my time would be best used noting the singular accomplishment and gift of Patrick Schumacher, one that he has rendered to architectural education. And I'm astonished to note that this achievement is already 20 years old this year. I speak, of course, about the Design Research Lab, established at the Architectural Association in 1996-97. With co-conspirator Brett Steele and now Theo Spiropoulos, Patrick has brought forth a new model of architectural education to the AA's post-professional MArch in architecture and urbanism. One that is truly experimental, research-driven, and shockingly productive. I just attended the DRL reviews a couple of weeks ago. That's not saying much. A few hundred people also attended this 2-day final review, come lecture series, come exhibition. A team-based, consultant-supported, and open-source studio format, Patrick's conception of an ideal design education works at far ends of the scalar spectrum, where students generate working, not schematic, not sci-fi, but working smart details that can be extrapolated outwards as interior environments, as buildings, as urban master plans. And at that urban end of things, there's a cagey morphological and economic analysis of the city undertaken by students, one that meets the twitching detail component in interesting and unexpected ways. The work is not bound by polished representation. There are proofs offered, trials and errors put on show. Manifestation and application are the order of the day. Applied research at a very sophisticated level that students feel totally invested in. And what is more, Patrick is totally invested in this academic project, which must count as one of his finest projects. He was on his toes throughout the 2 days, quick to fine-tune an argument, quick to help students see the potential of their work, quick to pin a guest critic down on a muddled point. Quick. Devoted and serious. That's Patrick Schumacher, the educator. And that's the Patrick Schumacher I want you to get to know this evening above all else. That lyric from the 90s hit of the Pet Shop Boys goes, "We were never being boring, and we never were holding back or worried about the time that might come to an end." That's an apt prelude to tonight's lecture. Please help me welcome Patrick Schumacher.
One, two, three. Great. Welcome, everybody. Thanks, Mark, for this sweet introduction. So I want to conduct this lecture in kind of seminar style. There's a lot to go through, but I want to also get a bit of engagement, and I might interrupt my talk to solicit questions. I know we only have an hour, but let's try. And yeah, it's apt that I haven't reflected actually on the fact that Colin Rowe used to be here, and Ungers, and the investment in formal research and compositional theory and formal innovation happened here and was influential all the way through to the AA when I, for instance, witnessed Kipnis in the very early 90s. Later on, I took over his unit which became the DRL. And he had the main, quite a rather aggressive slogan of formalism, not as a derogatory term, but as a positive agenda. And that stuck with me. I've never lectured about the topic, but I've recently published a paper with the title Formalism and Formal Research. So, Marc Garcia, thanks for the exhibition, it's very interesting. And I like the reflections on bringing out form for the form's sake through close-ups, where you lose the sense of the object itself and its identity, and you look at formal features. And he encouraged me to put a lot of images up, because I recently just gave a lecture at Greenwich where I think he was a bit disappointed that it was more text slides and talk and not so much visuals. So I will just fly through a number of our recent works. You guess you know most of them, but you can see here that there's a new morphology, a new world of endless forms, formal richness, which Saadid architects are known for, and Saadid actually was one of the greatest innovators in terms of form and space making and formal repertoires, which I think is very important. So this is some of the buildings we've been building around the world, and of course the archive itself in terms of unbuilt is about tenfold of that. I just can afford now to stick to build works because there's enough to make points and illustrate. I will not say much to this, but just show you the diversity of formal languages and formal systems which we brought into architecture and which weren't traditionally associated with architecture or buildings. These don't look at first sight like buildings, and of course they function very much like a new kind of buildings, endlessly transforming and shifting and moving space. So as you move through spaces like this, with each step the screen refreshes, as it were, with a new vista, and the space never comes to an end. It's an ever continuous, looping and ever-changing spatial experience. Just click through some of those. And interiors and the idea of an immersive, pulsating world is very, very important for us. So that continuity. So we always look at spaces rather than objects, if you like. And you can see the interest in differentiation and complexity and maintaining legibility in the face of complexity through forms of order, which we might discuss later. And the kind of increasing disciplining maybe of the repertoire and morphologies through structural, environmental, and material and fabrication logics, various engineering logics. The way some of these forms adapt to contextual conditions and unfold their internal complexity on a site without much context in a multi-use complex like this. And I think there's something which holds it all together as a recognizability, as a stylistic coherence, but it's also endless form. So we always like to look at a whole variety of morphologies at play across the oeuvre, and I'll talk to that as well. And when Zahan, myself sometimes talked about the work, we're grouping it into morphological families. So we are paying attention to form making and formal aspects, and we will come to see what this means and how this is usually criticized and why this might have to be defended. It's also the level of abstraction where you lose things like roofs, windows, walls, staircases, lights. They all fuse into an abstracted condition, but delivers all these elements nevertheless. The way you can maintain formal coherence across different spaces and different materials through some of the design moves being maintained. But this world, of course, crosses all the way from urbanism through larger building complexes into interiors, furnitures, and objects. And that's why I've announced a new epochal style parametricism, not as built only on Saadit's architects, but on a whole generation of architects working for the last 20 years. Latest endeavors to have a new conception of a tower as a fluid and internally hollow structure. Okay, so endless forms, and there's a formal richness, and my argument is that this has its advantages and needs to be defended. But initially, the concept of formalism is a derogatory. It comes in two ways. This is the more general concept, and excessive adherence to prescribed form is this kind of a stiffness, dryness, academic formalism. So again, which is set into contradiction with content and agility of expressing content if you stick to a kind of formalism. That is certain traditional forms of poetry, if you like. But in the design discipline, in our discipline, it's we're saying something like a design is being accused of formalism if it is driven by a concern with forms and formal qualities for their own sake. And in the final analysis, this is problematic, I would argue. But I think not every contribution to the discipline and its progress is a kind of final delivery. And in the interim, I think concern with forms and formal qualities could be even whole life projects in an overall division of labor. That's one of my key points I will make in the lecture. So if you accuse somebody of formalism, you say things like, this makes no sense, this is pure formalism. And that is something one can always level if one doesn't understand any functional motivation to the forms. So for instance, this morning we looked at the Morphosis library and noticed the brise-soleil paneling and the way it kind of fragments. That is an interesting move. One wonders, is that motivated? Maybe if it was a kind of curve wrapping and you lose necessity of these elements, it would be more motivated than it is now. But if you see it repeated on both south and north face, you would start to accuse it of formalism. And I think that is something we should take serious as a criticism. So at the same, my point is here has a certain nuance. But I still found it very important that Kipnis tried to revalue the values of architecture and put that concept of formalism as a banner for design research programs. So functionalism is the opposite of formalism, obviously. It's a doctrine that the design of an object should be determined solely by its function rather than by aesthetic consideration. And oftentimes in terms of the theory of functionalism or the approach and attitude, particularly in the 1920s under the heading of radical functionalism, ABC group, Hannes Meyer, it was something like design equals performance times economy. Oftentimes, though, there's a sense that the outcome of that, beauty is taken care of by itself through this process. It's inevitably beautiful what the outcome of a functionalist approach is, and that's something we are also worthy of consideration, although we can't take it literally. So I just wanted to point, if you had this question of form follows function, and you have different approaches of modernism and different, let's say, eras of modernism, and you can see that there's quite a diverse set of premises and expressions, all with the ethos of functionalism at play. So that tells you that is the determinateness of a functionalist approach is questionable. So we might have to finish the job of determination with certain formal choices which can no longer be motivated functionally. I just want to point out that in terms of the recent work of Zadid architects in particular, we are very much, that's for me an element of maturation, becoming more mature. We're interested in driving and developing morphologies through engineering logics of various kinds, and fabrication logics is a super thin, 1.5 millimeter thin aluminum shell, which was created by robotic folding, or the use of shell and tensile structures and the reticulation based on various analytic and optimization techniques. So these are pavilion structures we're creating. And yes, there is an element in the end of intricacy and beauty, but these lines have been orchestrated on the basis of structural optimization processes. And if you look at this, you do have a kind of looping of initial formal sets, positions through performance analytics into an evolutionary algorithm, in fact, which cycles and tests various formal propositions with respect to functional criteria. And in the end, it's very beautiful. It's also high performance, super light, super rigid. And there's a whole world of contemporary architects who pick up and develop these more richer, nature-like morphologies, very, very strongly driven by technical processes, but with the premise, which is different from older periods, of a freedom of locating, for instance here, the support points, so there's an agility and versatility, and then based on that you'll drive an optimization. This is Philip Block research, or the various pavilions of Achim Menges in Stuttgart. There's an ethos of functionalism, but an interest and I think excitement about richness of morphologies coming out of that. So the coincidence of formal and functional innovation in symbiotic co-evolution, if you like. So there's oftentimes also how do we find these new forms? And one thing I will be saying is that forms can never be deduced. They have to be generated and found somewhere, and then they can be tested. And there's a domain of analogical transferences. One could look at biomimetics, and one can just find forms, or can find forms and functional principles. And both, I think, is important, because the problem is always, where do we find these new forms which expand our repertoire of problem solving? So this is some of the pavilions in Stuttgart. And another ex-student of mine, also from the AA, Mark Fons, who has fabrication principle at work together with structural principles. And again, you generate a lot of richness. Color coding is arbitrary, but it also has a didactic tracking and tracing element to it. So I'm calling this recent work. I've been talking about parametricism, which is what's going on in architecture for the last over 20 years. This more recent work I wanted to call tectonism, because it develops a language out of the particular engineering logics, tectonic logics, in terms of fabrication, new fabrication, constraints, as well as structural and environmental constraints driving this. And for me, it's a subsidiary style within parametricism, just like brutalism or high-tech are subsidiary styles within modernism. And this takes on larger forms at the moment at Zadid Architects. This is a big building, and you can see there's a lot of potential for ornament and expressiveness. And that there you move from a concern with technologically driven morphologies, an interest in the expressiveness, and then making them speak in terms of differentiating atmospheres and characters in a very rich and ornate environment. For me, that ornamentation and expressiveness is also functional in a different sense. It is becomes a semiological project, if you like. And this expansion of morphologies for problem solving in terms of technical and organizational issues also becomes a morphology for enhancing the community capacity of the built environment. So ornament is not anti-functional. Ornament has always been functional in terms of a communication capacity of the built environment. And these are at the same time very, very high performance concrete shells, where the ribbing pattern is driven by force flows, and the opportunity for openings correlate with the force flows as well. Another project just been completed in Saudi Arabia, which is a big field space of hexagonal volumes, and there's a kind of set of drivers in terms of environmental shading and wind capture and staggering of against the wind, etc. But yet you wouldn't be able to deduce or generate form through such principles. It's always subjecting a formal world you bring to a problem, then to a series of manipulations and in a creative process which always depend on what I call the formal a priori you bring to the project. So the question of whether form follows function, and I deny this, so form cannot be deduced, but forms can be tested against performance criteria, and that's what we always do. So the design process, and that's a very, very general statement, is a generate and test process. And for that, we need to ask how do we actually generate form in our design medium, which might be traditionally the drawing, which is you kind of scribble lines or you move your hand around. And what comes out of that possibly, and I need to expand on that. And then, but also another subsidiary question we'll not focus too much on this lecture is how do you then test form in the design medium? What can the drawing actually, how do you, looking at the drawing, or what aspect of a later reality can you actually kind of check and test? I know that it's dimensional coordination, whether you have the right amount of square meter in there, you can, but also certain visual legibility aspects. But the first question is how do you actually generate form? And if your generation medium is very restrictive, the search space in which to search solutions is very restrictive, and you might therefore miss your target or remain suboptimal. That's why it's important to expand that space of possible forms under consideration. So this is again to bring that image up. So this kind of generate and test cycle is now looped into a particular design process, an evolutionary process. And in a sense, evolution itself is generate and test. And all design processes generate and test, and I can now kind of have an optimization process at play. But first of all, this is not starting from nothing. I have to give that process some initial input, and where do I get that from? So I'm not getting out of the problem of having to come up ex nihilo in a way. When I'm staring at my empty sheet or at the empty screen, where do I start? What do I have? What do I consider a beginning form for an architectural project? And that's where formal innovation stirs on. So formalism in literature has been discussed as well. So that's where it has been a positive concept for quite a while. In terms of looking at the work itself and its formal characteristics, its rhymes, meters, grammar, syntax, etc., rather than looking at the content too much and background knowledge. So that's been quite influential, and the notion of close reading is something which Kipnis also picked up. When Kipnis picked up on formalism and made it a project, he was aware of these tendencies in literary criticism and the focus on form versus content, or form versus background sociology, and this idea of a close reading, paying close attention to the formal operations, or in this case of language or poetry, was something Kipnis picked up on. And the same concept operates in art as well. So the emphasis on compositional elements, color, line, shape, texture, etc., as well as perceptual aspects, it's interesting as well, rather than the meaning and context. And I think traditionally in architecture schools, I mean, when I went to school in the 80s, we did have a subject matter, compositional theory, where we did look at a formal analysis of a building, which wasn't about the program and location and context, but purely in terms of formal terms. I think this was mostly taught here too, and in high school you also learned to do the same thing with paintings, the formal analysis of a painting where you look at balance, axes, a triangular composition, etc. So I think this is an important subsidiary skill and aspect which I defend and promote in architecture. So we have to look at formalism versus functionalism and how they not contradict each other. I think they contradict each other only temporarily, but in the final analysis pull together in an overall disciplinary evolution, as well as in an overall innovative project. And so I just want to say that, well, let me just ask if there's any questions at this point and worries, or anybody want to intercept? Come on. Anybody? Everybody happy? I'm waiting. Very quiet group. Let's see. All right, because it's getting a bit more theoretical now, a little bit. So this talking about form versus function, it seems to be, it's a very old story, you might think, and how can we not talk about something else? We can't. I mean, this is really what I call the lead distinction of the design disciplines, architecture, and our task is to give form to function. And or in another sense, if we start with form, we need to end up functionalizing this form. And what I find interesting to reflect on with respect to student work and university work, anyway, the way I've always taught was in the academic realm, design research lab. We're actually starting with formal systems, with spatial system, organizational patterns, with forms, and explore those, and then later on start to see how we might functionalize those forms. So we have a form to program heuristics, which is actually interesting, because this way you can really, you know that you will end up with something innovative and new and different. You start with formal explorations or systems observations. Then maybe they're driven by, sometimes by material properties, toying around with liquids, but so that's one thing. And of course, in the professional practice, you start with a function because you have given somebody's giving you a program, and you start matching up forms which fit that program. But what's very important for us in the dialectic between research, academic work, and professional work is that we have that parallel process. We're continuously generating new form in a space which doesn't have to deliver to particular programs, but in the end, will find programs, so kind of solutions in search of problems in the academic, then give us a lot of kind of solution space, which we then feed back onto the problems we have. That's been important. So, but by the way, and this is a separate issue, that the way I'm talking about functionality, social functionality, is not just that things are big enough, that things which in a process should be next to each other, made adjacent to each other, or certain technical shapes and forms, but that for me, functionality is a social ordering process and a communicative process. So just to hint at this. So giving form to function means, for me, communicative framing of communicative interaction. So the form becomes a spatial communication, and the function is a social interaction which responds to that communication. So just put that in brackets. It's not the primary topic for me. I keep it more general, but it's one way to interpreting forms and functions as communicating frames, communicating a social process, or framing a social process. So this task formula, which is giving form to function, of course presupposes that we distinguish form and function, and that's something which is not what we traditionally do. And in everyday life you don't do it. If you look at the chair, you just look at it as an essential unity, and a thing where form and function always are welded together, and you don't problematize this. So there's an abstraction in distinguishing these two aspects. And I think that's the founding moment of our discipline. So this implies that traditional fixed building types like villa, church, palace, town hall, townhouse, that is taken for granted form function unities, are now questioned. So if you talk about symmetry, proportion, or dynamic equilibrium, or various other compositional terms, it's a different language, it's an expert language. That's not the way ordinary people, or traditionally we've talked about it. And also we talk about functions like, we don't talk about windows, but maybe kind of interfaces and visual interfaces, or lighting perforations. So we have abstract descriptions of the function which don't prejudice already a form. And on the other hand, we have maybe descriptions of forms which don't necessarily are hooked up already with particular functions. So we need to dissociate these two domains, and that's very interesting to me. And in the modernists were very clear about this. They wanted to get rid of these phrases like window, door, roof, house. I wanted to have an abstract language for the functionalities, like interchanges. Interchanges, they had phrases like this, and I think it's very important. But also on the form side, we have abstract notions. So this is for me very important. Founding moment of the discipline, because this distinction comes in the Renaissance with Alberti, together with an innovative thrust. Because if you only talking about doing another villa, another church, another palace, you in the domain of what I call tradition-bound building, you just keep doing the same. You don't have to problematize what you do, neither on the functional or the formal aspect. So the distinction of form and function poses the question of the effective correlation. So you pull them apart and you have two realms, lots of forms, lots of functions, and another question is, how do you map one onto the other? And there's a freedom of picking forms for functions or giving functions to forms. And if you have these two sets of aspects of characteristics, and the bigger the sets, the more powerful you are in a way. So functions are now posed as problems, and forms are posited as solutions. And then the traditional canon becomes available for dissection and recombination, both in the formal and functional dimension. And that's, for me, I call it the inauguration of architecture in contrast to tradition-bound building. It becomes a rational reflective discipline, capable of innovation, because you're actually in a problem solving and in an innovative and creative mood and mode. And if you read Alberti's work, that becomes through very strongly. So the discipline as an academic and theory-led discipline, which also has now a kind of, let's say, a medium of speculation, the design medium like the drawing, that this also comes along at the same time with theory and innovative thrust. That's why we have a discipline, because we are in the game of innovation, trying to generate something new, because if you just do what has always been done, you actually don't need an architectural discipline. That builders can do that with pattern books or with the same process in which they keep building the same. That was all pre-Renaissance building, was in a sense construction troops which have certain routines by which they just keep doing the same thing. But if you do something radically different, you have to convince people. You need to draw the design medium of drawing and speculating, of projecting, and you need theory to explain why you're doing what you're doing, which is no longer taken for granted, which is so different. You kind of potentially upset a lot of people, or they don't understand what you're trying to do. So that's for me maybe the most important phrase and insight in the lecture you should remember. So when we're talking about the domain of forms, and that they're now a pool of potential solutions, a solution space of resources by which we can now address creatively certain functional problems, then if you expand that repertoire, if you have more forms to choose from, that's great, because then you're in a better chance to solve your problems, because formal repertoires are problem-solving repertoires. And an expanded formal repertoire delivers an enriched problem-solving toolbox. And so some people can just work on that toolbox and just generate more without using them yet. And that's the formal innovators. And those I want to defend, even if they themselves are not very good at problem-solving, they just generate more capacity for the problem solvers to pick up on. But I'll tell you, but within an office like Zadid Architects, when we started, we are both at the same time doing all these paintings, drawings, and strange sketches and models, generating forms. But then we're also addressing this in competitions, and we start using these forms and discover that, and we have to solve problems with these forms. And it turns out that we are very good. We're actually having better solutions in the end because we had more range of options to address. For instance, complex sites, intricate briefs with multiple sized rooms and many, many connections between rooms, and we had more problem-solving capacity. So form versus function, I call this the lead distinction of the discipline. And basically what it ties up with, we always working on forms. That's our world. Architecture is, in that sense, form. And we are delivering function, which is we're construing social processes. So I'm saying form function maps on architecture versus society. And this is a bit arcane, that's why I put it here in light gray. This is, you can read more about this in my theories. That is a system and environment. So for me, the discourse of architecture is a societal subsystem and a system of communications where we talk with each other with certain through words and drawings and build forms. And we existing in an environment which is the rest of society. So the system versus environment distinction is embedded here. Basically, it's architecture versus society. And that lead distinction in a sense maps onto that system environment distinction. So form is our internal reference and self-reference within the discipline. and function is the external reference, the world reference. So if you work on a project, we are in charge of the forms, which is internal to us, our capacity and actually exclusive and universal competency with respect to the totality of the built environment and the world of artifacts. Any form in the world which you encounter in the world has been designed by a colleague, which is this industrial designer, the space, the mouse, the font, the websites, anything which structures our world is a designer's thing. And I promise you that. And when you go outside, it continues in cities with landscape design and garden design and lighting design and what you wear. These are all colleagues of ours. And every one of them knows Zaha Hadid or anybody. Let's say, or look at the world of the the whole 20th century. Everything goes to that little needle's eye of our design discourse. Look at the characters of the Bauhaus. When Korb, Mies, and Gropius met at Behren's office, and then they founded the Bauhaus and what they create in terms of urbanism, architecture, interior, the world of products and textiles, everything in the 20th century is here. Actually, it's not, everything here we're living is a kind of Bauhaus creation, the chairs you're sitting on, etc. And that's what I want to point out, that this is at the universal and exclusive competency, and that gives us the power. So that if we're in that discourse, so if somebody like Zaha Hadid is radically innovating and expanding the potentials, that impact radiates through everything you ever encounter in the world. And now we're in that discourse with certain leaders. If you lead this discourse, you have huge impact, and everybody now on the internet can throw something on a new creation, a new thing, which kind of radiates through the web and lands on every designer's kind of screen, and then the next moment will influence what he will do, and the total output of the world the way we live in is based on this. So that is, and the internal reference, but then the rest of the world, of course, is not only this kind of form aspect, it has also the other aspects, the life processes with all the other aspects and inputs, is what we consider and frame and engage with when we make these designs. So what is an architectural idea? I mean, in a simple sense, use this form for that function. That's the creative act, right? And if that's unusual and you can be proud of that, that this is original, then this is the idea, an architectural idea. But I think there's a kind of a meta element here. It's in a particular design. That's what an idea is, but also to bring an unprecedented family of forms for the first time into architecture. It's the kind of thing Zaha did. That's kind of a much more momentous architectural idea within the discipline. And not only architecture, but for me, architecture and the design disciplines are one universe, has always been, like all the disciplines which occurred in the Bauhaus in our oeuvre, including fashion design. Fashion is incredibly important also to structure social communication, frame social communication. It's a kind of semiological system, which is very important as well. And maybe even more empowering to introduce new generative process to architecture, which then generates a whole new sets and worlds of forms, brings into play. So these are also important innovations in architectural ideas. And they're all in the domain of form and in an expanded sense of working within a kind of formalist project. So I'm just showing a few things in terms of moves. Sometimes these are not in terms of not just new kinds of forms, but also processes by which you generate forms. For instance, this idea of interpenetration or intersection of two pre-existing forms was a monumental innovation. This came out in the, I think it's Eisenman in 1970. And was a kind of, generates a whole new world of things. And you can then at home do that, in your studio. and suddenly you're additionally empowered. For me as a young architect in the mid 80s, this was a shock of revelation when we realized the Tschumi's La Villette project brought that home, that you could, if you design your sheet, make different certain pattern, a certain organization for that urban field or for that plan, that you can do one here and then you move to the next and do another pattern and another, that you can superimpose, that you can do one pattern, for instance, the three primary forms, the square, the circle, and the triangle. You can break them up. It's also interesting. You can apply them as one, and in the same space you impose a grid of points where each point are different. Then you throw a squiggly line across this as well. So you have different designs just overlaying and competing and simultaneously operating in the same space. So you design the same space 3 times, 4 times. And then you have 3 or 4 radically different competing reference system operating in the same space. That for us was a shock. And we saw this. The next day, the whole school was doing this. I guess you noticed some of this. And we all felt empowered by this. And the power of this is that, if you put your mouse here, I'm either in the center of this circle, or I can say I'm at this certain bend of the squiggly line, or I'm at a certain folly. So I have 3 different ways of locating. I have different audience can pick and choose where they want to be. So I think it's very potent and also sociologically empowering diagram. So when we did, a little bit later, I taught in Columbia, we did the same thing. We built urban textures in this kind of superimposition system, but we did more than this. We started to use computers for the first time also, and these kind of systems were starting to be affiliated to each other. They were affecting and inflecting each other, and there are other things like compression and directionality and gradients operating. So the Tschumi aspect with multiple inflection rather than indifference was at play, plus conditions of differentiating each level. So the point grid, which is even and isotropic, is here becoming a kind of squeezed and distorted grid because certain interventions come in. So this is the way we, for instance, took something like this and ran with it and expanded on this. Already from basically on the transition from deconstructivism to parametricism. This is what we came up with in the 93 in Columbia University, where Tschumi was still actually a dean. And I wanted to show how these are radical, really crazy, strange moves, the kind of pleating of whole landscapes and given forms, operations, which became this kind of folding, of crinkling and squeezing, seemingly absurd. And then this was turned into, through certain computation techniques, into kind of soft pleating and folding and molding. And the idea of bringing in these strange ontologies and operations where you suddenly manipulate NURB surfaces and blobs and metaballs with control points and attractor points and so on. And what came out of that? That's interesting. At that point, we discovered the work of Ferrotto, who has been operating in a kind of niche condition, primarily with stadiums and pavilions and so on, as somebody we could look at. And that he had also these kind of more fluid and organic forms and open and soft forms, which was radically anti-architectural in many ways. But what is interesting here, that they had already a kind of rational disciplining operation, whereas we were just toying and playing with forms and then starting to see what we can do with them in terms of an ordering of urban processes. Here we had an additionally structural rationalities embedded in these forms. And again, the whole idea of expanding through techniques and scripting techniques, through Grasshopper and so on, you get also not only a new ontology, a NURB surface, a blob, but you also get new ideas like associative logics, that you have dependency relations between subsystems. So they are coming natural with certain parametric modeling technique, but they're also not only a formal new world, but a new conceptual world of resonances between subsystems, for instance. And so these were the important. In DRL, we doubled up these process-driven new morphologies with material attempts and form-finding processes again. And the advantage here is that these processes, through kind of material form-finding logic, they embed already material and structural logics, and have a certain rule-based coherence which one can harness. I think this is something. Again, this is system research. This is more than pure just forms. They are kind of morphologies which have material aspects embedded, but there's no program condition. There's no architectural, social problem-solving condition. But later on we added that. We looked at these forms and see what could they be useful for? Where could that become interesting? What kind of conditions can we address with these in a form-to-program heuristics? And we, of course, realized that some of this embedding of structural and fabrication logics you find in older figures, not only for Otto, but also Dieste and Gaudi. So we have any questions at this point? What time is it? Anyway. So what should we care about in terms of forms and function? And I'm saying the form is only a means to an end in the final analysis, and we should ultimately care only about its function. But access to function is always mediated via forms. We must design the form, work on the form. We must invest in developing rich and versatile repertoires of forms and develop intuitions about the functional potential of the various forms in our repertoire. So that's formal research. There's no direct access to function. And I sometimes criticize, let's say, the functionalists, like the radical functionalists in the modernist period, or if you look at firms like OMA and REM, these kind of discourses, they are program innovators. They're interested in cross-programming. They're interested in unusual juxtaposition to innovate on the brief and so on. I like that, and they're concerned with this, and they look what's required, what's going out there in society, all good or important. So there is this kind of researching reality to see what society would need, but what is problematic there, they don't have any conception and care and concern and talk and discourse about the formal resources they would bring to address these programmatic and organize these programs. So they just talk straight about and only about program and functions. So when they doodle and design, they talk only about the programs, they shuffle and reshuffle without any reflection on the means by which they do this. And that makes, in a sense, suboptimal. They talk as if forms was transparent and trivial and not inflicting harm or empowering function, because they have a kind of formal a priori they never talk about. There's mostly boxes and rectilinear organizations, as if that was the natural and only way of organizing these programs. And there's a kind of myopic condition there, which we need to criticize. So that kind of the not recognizing that that one has to expand the formal repertoire or query, with which morphology one starts attacking a certain program domain. That is rarely problematized, let's say, and there's no language to help make that explicit and more potent, let's say. Now, I want to attach something else as well, which is the whole idea of aesthetic valuation. And because when we talk about the investment in forms, we usually like or dislike them. We love this, we're stimulated, we talk about beauty and ugliness rather than, and that's part of the seemingly part of the agenda of composition to make it, to achieve beauty. So what does that mean? How is that coming to play? And and again, I'm not dismissing this. I mean, at Zaha Architects, I've reflected on the fact that when we are working on projects with unusual forms, we bring these to bear, we're trying to organize a program, and then we get the various rooms and spaces and adjacencies and connections and routes to work. We look at what we're doing, and then we've kind of more or less solved the diagram, and but then we have only done 5% of our work or 10%, and then for the next 90%, we're kind of working over and over on massaging and articulating and trying to achieve, I don't know, what are we trying to achieve actually? We invested in achieving that elegance, that poise, that tension, that beauty in the end. So it must mean something, there must be something behind this investment. Otherwise, I mean, it seems like outrageously wasteful if that wasn't something worthwhile. So what is it? And I'm offering some answers to this. So first of all, the evaluated terms is so utility is something is more or less functional, useful or useless, or it is beautiful or ugly. So we have these two evaluative codes. I call them the code of beauty and the utility and the code of beauty, and we're always working on both at the same time. And Zaha Architects and many of us working on this a lot, trying to formally resolve to achieve beauty. And and my theory of aesthetic values is basically that there is a rationality to aesthetic valuation. So for me, aesthetic values, when I find something beautiful, that means something, and means I somehow intuitively recognize that this is performing for me, or good for me, life enhancing. So aesthetic values encapsulate condensed collective experiences via useful dogmas. At that moment of being attracted to something, I don't necessarily know why, but I trust it. So the inherent inertia implies in this, that they progress via evolution rather than evolution. So I might be attracted to something and I trust this, but maybe I shouldn't anymore. Maybe I should grow up and start to appreciate something else. And historically, we've moved through various ideals of beauty, and there's an inertia there, and we have to be unhooked from anachronistic aesthetic investments and sensibilities. But it is important that we always, at any time, must rely on navigating the world aesthetically. Because you can't, when you step into a space, into a city, analyze all the pros and cons and advantages. You just go by an intuition. You're conditioned to appreciate or reject. And so I say beauty is a promise of performance. And one can start to demonstrate this in some kind of images like this. And I mean, make your pick. You can, in a very graphic way, you can also show that these, and I will come to it, they will historically evolve a lot, but there's also, to some extent, an universal invariant aspect of beauty, which is to do with, it's maybe very graphic, but the dysfunctional is perceived as ugly. Where something is, first of all, deviating from the norm, but also you sense that these are dysfunctional aspects. So the invariant aspect of beauty is maybe order versus chaos. But there's a variable aspect of beauty. So, of course, historically, our life conditions, technologies, and what works well for us keeps changing. So the relative performances of different forms, urban forms, I'm now, of course, in particular interested in urban and architectural forms, those shift. So we have to shift our sensibilities. So you have another example is ideals of beauty in historically shift and change. So just as a fact, and could try to make sense of this. In the 18th, 19th century, somebody is very voluptuous and fat. Also, a male would be looked at as more attractive, representing wealth and health. And now it would no longer be like this. But I want to also look at these, obviously. This is what we're really interested in. The historical relativity of ideals of beauty. So there's a kind of transformation and changing. When symmetry and proportion was important, that was when we had stone construction and we had to have certain vertical proportions in windows openings. We had to pull in the windows a bit from the edge. Symmetry was important at the time when we couldn't calculate foundations, and you can rely on, if you would make it too asymmetric, you have the building cracking up because you have differential settlement. So there's a number of aspects, and actually there's a consciousness of these aspects, in Palladius' writings, for instance. But there's also, you can recognize the orderly elements and parts of a villa, that elements which belong together and so on, as something which is you recognize the good society, the good house, the sound house through an aesthetic image. And of course, this shifts in modernism. You can give up symmetry and proportion, and later on you can give up this kind of serial mass-produced repertoire. So we need to trust our aesthetic sensibilities, both when we step into environment and we're intuitively attracted to a kind of complex busyness and buzziness of a city. We like the kind of intensity of a certain 24/7 network-like city, and we get kind of bored by a more sterile and orderly condition. In the contemporary world, we need to understand and develop the sensibilities, which places to go to, which places to avoid, where you would find stimulating interaction partners, etc. So we need to learn and relearn aesthetic sensibilities. But there's also an element in terms of the appearance and formal work. It's not only working on making something, selecting the right kind of stylistic world, whether it's a more classical, modernist, or parametricist repertoire, and you should start to like and be attached to and find beauty in those repertoires which are most fitted to the contemporary world of society and technology. But we're also working, when we're homing in and working on the composition and working on the form and its elegance, we're working on something like perceptual legibility, whether when you generate and compose the massing, whether you sense that these pieces belong together, they have a kind of center of gravity, and that when you look at it from all the different sides, that you can still see, although they look different and it's versatile, it's the same building you encounter at different sides. And when you go inside, there's some reminiscing of the exterior. So there's a coherence between outside, inside, left, right, and behind, etc. So we're working when we're compositionally working not only on some kind of facile fetishistic investment, we're working on the legibility, and maybe also on the semiology. Do I recognize that this is a school rather than a factory, or does it give the sense of being a cultural building rather than an office building? That kind of expression of a communicative capacity. That's what we're working intuitively. We're working on this when we work on the design. That's my claim here. But we should maybe make this more explicit in what I call the phenomenological and the semiological project. So, and I'm saying in a way that this double investment in utility and beauty is demarcating our discipline and makes it distinct for us compared to neighboring disciplines like engineering. So engineers don't have that investment in elegance, beauty, and formal resolution. They can't. That's not within their professional competency. They don't care about this. They care about the numbers, about the efficiency, about the structural efficiency. And if you would let them work only concerning to these kind of pragmatic technical issues, they would just do a kind of hatchet job of pasting together, most efficient column, most efficient beams, windows, all in terms of technical efficiency, and they would lack a sense of coherence and legibility. It will end up looking like those spaces where engineers are in charge, like factories or machine rooms, backyards where the architect is giving up, formalizing and compositionally controlling what's going on. There you have an engine, purely from pragmatic technical criteria, pasting and bolting together whatever is efficient without compositional. So here comes a certain handle, which is the easiest and cheapest and robust here. There's no concern of formally connecting up with the ceiling element or the lighting because they have nothing functionally to do. That is an engineering, that sensibility. And so we must insist on that concern for beauty, composition, legibility, communicative capacity as something which is essential to our discipline, which then constrains all the technical elements. We can still do it, we can still orchestrate, because there's always many ways of doing something technically efficient. And we orchestrate and collect together under the auspices of a compositional stance. On the other hand, I think we're distinguishing ourselves for artists because we do care about utility and functionality after all as well. And that's very important. And that's sometimes where Eisman and Kipnis are on the edge of slipping out of our discipline nearly. If you never concern yourself with those functional, organizational aspect. So this kind of code of what you're concerned, that questions of elegance, beauty, and formal resolutions are always relevant, but at the same time, questions of performance, functionality, social functionality in particular, are always relevant. This is demarcating the design disciplines, separating sharply from, on the one hand, engineers, on the other hand, artists who don't have to care about it. These kind of neighboring disciplines, these kind of is a kind of my demarcation thesis. And we have kind of separated out against these two. And they were all wrapped into one originally. But this double code of utility and beauty, that we're always concerned with form, beauty, elegance, composition, always concerned at the same time with utility and the way things work and operate. These are very abstract categories. They're always at play for the last 500 years across all styles, but there's something which is variable and it keeps changing. These are very abstract categories, and they guarantee that this defines our discipline for centuries, and also, I think, going forward. Now we have, but which forms of beauty, which ideals of beauty, which forms we're considering the right and beautiful, and that keeps changing, that's historically evolving, at the same time as involving what we consider to be the utility aspects, the functional, how we want buildings to function, for instance, very, very differently now than 50 years ago, and even more different from 200 years ago. So the kind of, on the programmatic functional side, our values are transforming, as well as on the formal side. So, and this is where I'm coming in. So we have a code, these kind of categories, these questions, and then we have programs which make them specific at each historical period, and that is my definition of a style. What is a style doing? The style is in a particular historical period making concrete and operational that very abstract and general demand for beauty by saying now specifically how to achieve it and which formal elements are to be pursued and which formal qualities are to be rejected, and the same in terms of utility and functioning elements. So styles are design programs, they're design research programs also in my view. And I'm also saying that there is no designing without implicit or explicit style. So people reject the very concept. But you need to have a particular set of criteria which allow you actually to progress the design process. If you work, you must have a certain aesthetic at play. You can't keep switching or pretending that you have no formal decision criteria at play or no particular functionality criteria at play, for instance. And I will jump over this for now. And I want to come to this. So what I'm saying is style is defined by both formal and functional heuristics. Functional heuristics are principles that guide the interpretation of the brief and the functional elaboration of the design, and formal heuristics, the principles that limit the formal repertoire and guide the formal elaboration of the design. And I just want to express that in terms of parametricism. For me, it's important that the style has both these aspects, because these are not art styles, these are design styles. So they must have a particular attitude and concern and set of principles how we in general, in the contemporary, as parametricists, approach briefs, programs, and functionality. So we are, and that makes us very, very distinct from modernism. So we are no longer considering, when we look at a brief and read something like classroom and foyer or lecture hall, these as very fixed stereotypes, right? We always thinking in terms of hybridization and a variety of maybe lecture halls. This is interesting, the way this bleeds up into the studio and the way there's windows all over the place. So it's already an unusual lecture hall. That would be a kind of the spirit. We would look at no longer in terms of one standard, like the modernists would have. Everything would be a kind of socially homogenized standard, the house of minimum existence, the residential unit, the office, the entertainment zone. And we also wouldn't have that attitude of segregative zoning. So the principles which guide the way we conceive of and handle functions is I call them taboos nearly. That's we bring that in advance as parametricists or as contemporary architects to the problem. Positively, we'd like to have all functions to be variable, parametrically variable event scenarios. So we look at something which comes in all sorts of varieties of programs with different audiences, different sizes, with different character at different times. So, and we like, instead of segregation, we like these things to interconnect, be inter-aware and interpenetrate in their functionality and interact in their functionality. So that would be the spirit and sensibility of parametricism. And I think this lines up and is congenial to the formal heuristics. And so this would be certain formal principles at play, which you, for instance, you don't work with rigid forms anymore. I don't know how you work here, but we, in terms of my studio and my friends and the whole generation for over 20 years, we are no longer working with rigid forms like rectangles or squares, circles, spheres, cylinders, triangles. We don't. They all kind of become malleable. We don't work by simple repetition, and we don't do what the deconstructivists still did, just collaging elements, just putting disparate elements together and leaving them unrelated, positively. So these forms are all variable. If we have, instead of a circle, we have a blob, a spline which fits and adjusts and adapts and is malleable to its conditions. Instead of repetition, we differentiate, we iterate, we vary an element as it sweeps across around a facade, for instance. We wouldn't use the same panel, but it keeps kind of modulating and differentiating. And the different pieces and aspects and subsystems which come together, which remain rigid and unconnected in modernism, for instance, they all inflect each other, they all resonate with each other, they recognize and are sensitive to each other and adapt to each other. So, and you can see that these formal principles have to do with the functional principles, because we like these different parts of the building to inter-articulate or correlate, because we want these rooms to communicate and be inter-aware of each other. They're not just separate, they bleed into each other and they're aware of each other. So this is the way I want to talk about styles as having these heuristics, having these set of principles, as well as an expanded repertoire which then is unfolded. And yes, the formalist temporarily has potentially a one-sided approach to this. And you can, when I wrote these principles in an article about parametricism, it was retrospective, and these principles had been at play for over a decade. I was just canonizing the way we had judged and worked, that we actually hadn't used these rigid forms anymore, that we hadn't allowed ourselves to just design by simple repetition of elements, that we hadn't allowed ourselves to just make a collage condition, and that we were always looking for new ways to keep forms malleable and variable, that we were always differentiating systems and correlating the differentiated systems, and that you could always do more of this. These were principles which I just observed. I wasn't saying, hey, that's the way we from now on have to work. This is the way we've been working for over a decade without exception. And then saying, hey, why? I was surprised initially by that long-term stability of, this was DRL 10 at the time, we had 10 years of DRL, and so I think, but the formal principles were more at play and more reflected. And so there was a kind of formalist tilt to the whole of parametricism. And I brought these out. They were less explicit, they were less clear. And anyway, we were in early stages of avant-garde movement, always initially muscle flexing and playing around with new forms, and they're not yet in a hard reality condition of delivering on large projects. So I had to kind of push and bring forth and bring alive the necessity to align these formal principles with contemporarily justifiable and important socio-programmatic principles. And for me, the style is always innovative on both. And with each new era, because we have a new way, a new kind of societal process, we need to understand our programs in a new way, and then to translate them. It would be great to have a new set of formal capacities, formal operations at play. And that's why when a new style is born, when you can see that, so this is much more concrete than just saying utility and beauty. There's a whole set of principles on utility. There's a whole set of principles on beauty. But these are themselves still have degrees of freedom and abstraction. So there's many, many ways in which you can make a form variable. But you just have to find one. and what this form is, whether it's a line, a spline, a blob, a surface, a field of fragments, a swarm, there could be many things, but you have to have this degrees of that variability in it. You need to differentiate according to rule-based, and then you need to correlate. If you have your surface and then you have your fragments, there needs to be some kind of scripted correlation. But which one it is, there's an enormous degrees of creative freedom of interpretation under these principles. And within this frame now, there's a lot of formal innovation possible. And you can also start writing into it technological constraints, like the way we have a tessellated complex surface, yes, differentiated, but now you have additional criteria at play. So that's where, so there's enormous, that formal research continues. It is maybe less radical than the formal innovative push, shifting, let's say, out of something like modernism via deconstructive into parametricism. That's a huge formal re-gearing. And that's why I distinguish between revolutionary innovation and progress and cumulative. After that shift was happening, now we're in a cumulative condition. I think formal sensitivity and an awareness that formal innovation and research should always continue remains important, but it's now in a certain principally framed space, I would argue. I mean, I've canonized it this way, very, very abstractly and openly. We can discuss it and challenge it. A lot of people didn't like that I'm starting to kind of, as if I'm prescribing anything. No, I'm not prescribing, just describing what had been a convergence which captured a whole generation and was adhered to on that level of abstraction without exception. I think we could maybe open up the debate at this point. While you gather your thoughts, I'm just showing you a few more of these, the way we looked at Zaha the architects. That repertoires, what it might mean to generate repertoires. And that we have different families of formal conditions, which in retrospect, and different analogies of bringing in new formal universes into architecture, so, but I leave it at that. Let's discuss. Yeah.
Thanks for your lecture, Patrick. I'm really interested in a lot of these topics, and I have a lot of questions that I think you'll be happy to answer. This is not one of them. This is a question from our live audience of one in Paris. His name is John Zisevich. He says, you talked about form being generated and tested against evolutionary or functional forces, but I'm sure you'll agree these forces are not limited to just gravity or structure or light. They're also based on society and politics. So my question relates back to your comments in Berlin in November against public housing and public space, which actually caused some of your critics to align you with Trump. Have the forces of the backlash of those comments caused a change in the form of your provocations?
Well, thanks for the question, first of all. I mean, I might duck the particulars of some of the particulars of the question, because what I find interesting, the way the questioner started, pointing out that in terms of the functional programmatic constraints or criteria which are brought to the formal process, and I know which image he was thinking about, structural optimization, criteria driving in an evolutionary process a formal artifact into a final shape. I'm now working on a research project, and he's quite right that in the end, social functionality issues are incredibly important. And in the end, what I'm saying, or what I'm currently emphasizing, is social functionality within parametricism. So when we set up a, let's say, formal spatial composition with a particular set of program agendas and concerns, I'm now starting to get a feedback built into the model, which is what I call live process modeling. I start to model crowd interaction in a space, and then that's the testing of the layout. So when I then change walls, open gaps and opportunity of moving across and changing other elements in the design, I can see how that impacts the occupancy patterns and human interaction potentials in the space. So that would be the way I started to work on a modeling, which also then allows itself to some kind of user in the loop optimization process. I'm not there with this respect, but if you had certain crowd configurations modeled in a space, and that's what we care about, this would be the social ordering of space. We don't care about the wall, the ceiling by itself, the door, the openings, the visual openness between spaces. We care about how that allows for an interaction process and a communication process to unfold, and that's what we're watching, and that becomes a success criterion on this. Of course, for that to be started, we have to initially also pose certain formal worlds, and they're coming out of a repertoire of parametricism. But then the particular disciplining and optimization of these initially positive configurations would come through that process of how the crowd evolves and picks up patterns of interaction which are more productive and desired. Now, so that's an interesting point for me, which is what I call parametricism 2.0, is something into the future, where this idea of rationalizing formal repertoires through feeding back performance criteria are now moving, not so much focusing anymore, hopefully only on the technical performance criteria, but on social performance criteria. And this is a hard work through what I call agent-based live process modeling. Now, in terms of the talk in Berlin and the backlash, I mean, what I didn't quite expect was the way these things fed into media outlets, rather than staying within a group of disputants where I'm known, where people know where I'm coming from, and where there was a whole list of discussions and points made. So I was kind of a bit shocked with the backlash there, and a little bit unhappy that I felt misunderstood and defamed in ways which were not conducive to a frank conversation. So I hope that I'm now a bit more cautious in front of which audience, what kind of point can be pushed, and what's the media presence, which then maybe pulls things out of context. So that would be my answer to that aspect. But in principle, I don't have to withdraw any of the opinions I voice, and if you guys want to discuss that now, here, or later at drinks, that's very, very welcome. But I'm not sure if you know what this about the story. I don't know.
I have a small question precisely of what you have said in this answer, and particularly related to the idea of the crowd, and the problem how the crowd it's actually socially or political or economically defined. And that's bring me somehow to the idea of architecture urbanism as defined by Haussmann, and it's a way of controlling the riots. So
I mean, I have other lectures where I make this a much more explicit theme and presentation. So if some of you want to look that up, in my recent AD, Parametrism 2.0, I have an article on social functionality through agent-based parametric semiology and live process modeling. So it's a little bit abstract for me now to talk about it. The way I see it is I would suggest that in the final analysis, when it comes to working with clients, and that's what I'm gearing up towards, this kind of new capacity of modeling interaction processes is initially geared to, of course, environments where there's a lot of complexity in the audience, many people interacting in very fluid scenarios. I'm thinking of corporate environments. I'm thinking of companies like Google, which I've pitched this kind of work to. And so this wouldn't be crowd management in a political space. This is an attempt to make us more intelligent about what we're actually proposing when we offer particular layouts and arrangements with various entrances, the distribution of certain meeting rooms, cafeterias, open spaces, maybe in the urban or in something like a campus environment, Google campus. It's very hard for us to grasp and understand what we're offering and what impact our layouts might have if we don't start to model the complexity, because it's no longer very simplistic like in a modernist office where you know how many people you have and you dedicate a seat for everyone and just lock them onto their seats and their different apartments. We're now living in an environment where we're designing spaces where there's a lot of fluidity and self-directedness, where we don't place people. So the premise of this is, how can we still know what we're doing in a situation where there's a lot of individual freedom, self-directedness, even self-organization, how groups form, clusters form, interactions emerge in such environments. And if you go to Google, you get that feeling of a freely roaming, self-organizing group. They don't have necessarily dedicated spaces. Some of them still have. We just designed a building also in Antwerp where we have activity-based, deterritorialized and depersonalized spaces. People don't have their specific desk. So to model that, to get a handle on that, and get a sense of what clients or that group of employees, visitors and so on would actually prefer and like in terms of encountering each other, communicating, having synergies, meeting across departments, within departments. So that's the world. It's a little bit micro-political. It's not political in the big sense. It's not attempt to engineer and control crowds. It's about facilitating interaction processes which are desired from the people and participants, and to deliver satisfying experiences to participants. That's the attempt. And for that to function, I mean, we presuppose, and we do it in comparative setups. We compare, for instance, the minimalist layout, where you have rectilinear boxes and subdivisions and zoning, versus one of open, fluid, Bürolandschaft style layouts where you have open sections, you have gradient transformations rather than strict thresholds. And then we can see what we can then comparatively also validate, hopefully, and show that the kind of repertoire of parametricism has more facilitation rather than a kind of orthogonal. For instance, oftentimes you have inputs into one building from many different directions. If everything has to be channeled into an orthogonality, it becomes problematic if you allow different directions to come in but flow to it through, rather than being kind of meandering through in rugged sense. So there's a number of things in terms of the visual legibility of complexity, something we work on. This would be the way we're starting to load up and test in
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I just have one small question. So today's lecture is presented as a series of principles, right? So presented in a very determined manner. So I guess my question is, can you give us an example where you have to negotiate between these principles that you talk about, either between themselves or with other conflict of interest? The reason why I asked about negotiation is because it seems like the buildings that your office produce is uncompromising in form, but at the same time, they also carry a lot of negotiations, I feel.
Yeah, well.
So like if you could give one specific example, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, I can try. We can move on to maybe. Oh, no, I can't. Wait. No, I've just jumped out. Yeah. So I mean, this is a building, for instance. I mean, the principles, they're non-negotiable. The principles, right? But that's okay because they're very, very general and abstract. They say, for instance, don't use rigid, uninflected forms. So if a very irregular site in the center of Seoul with different levels, different entries, many different things coming together, there's also a park attached. So don't use a big square or big cylinder. As if a kind of formalist, monumentalist prejudice. That is most probably a wrong solution, right? So we are saying, so that principle, no rigid Platonic forms, is non-negotiable because I would argue, in the contemporary condition, this is 90.99% always false. Instead, we're starting with a form, blob-like or an open form, and that is malleable, and that's a principle which we always demand. And then, of course, you can use the negotiation you're talking about is more the way this form is now fitting itself into a condition, the way it resonates with aspects of the site, the way it pulls an entrance at this point, the way it opens up itself to here. That's a kind of massaging in, working in, fitting in, negotiating a form with constraints of boundary conditions, level conditions, and internal program distribution conditions, let's say. And the idea of having this whole thing penetrable, it's not blocking, this is a public part, so you can flow through. There's a number of things where you can move through underneath, you can move on top and enter, and there's a coherence also between exterior and interior. So there's a project which also I think has complex variegated order, has a lot of complexity, a lot of constraints, a lot of ongoing, and yet is trying to give legible, coherent way of navigating this and understanding this, where all major entrances are very strongly articulated. This is an example of a project, but the principles of degrees of freedom of adaptive variability in the elements, the differentiation of the subsystem, and the correlation, the resonance, the look for resonances between aspects is brought to bear here. So I don't think as I said, the principles are non-negotiable, but one of the principles is always negotiate with contextual conditions, always embed and fit in, always localize in many ways, and look for resonances. Yep.
Two questions. One, I guess, addresses the form-function relationship, and the second one, more of the social performance. The first one is, do you think that sort of very harsh distinction between form and function, sort of considering them as separate entities, has resulted in people trying to stay away from sort of thinking about form more consciously, or perhaps shape more consciously, rather than perhaps saying, you know, form is function, the aesthetic value of something does have a performative aspect. It plays a role within a given society, culture, and that is its function. Do you think perhaps in the future it will be more about thinking of form and function as correlated, intertwined more closely, instead of utility versus beauty? And then the second question, so when you talk about parametricism 2.0 and how it might be about optimizing desired relationships, sort of crossovers between different groups, do you think that that could also be used productively in order to perhaps generate non-desired but productive conflict in between different groups in any given sort of building or space? Because oftentimes I think there is this obsession with not recognizing that there are issues that need to be addressed within any sort of social context. So do you think architecture using that interaction design could address it by, again, promoting conflict in between the parts, and hopefully that resulting in a dialogue of sorts, inevitably?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I mean, there's a lot of in what you're saying which resonates with me. I mean, the idea of conflict is interesting. That was the big topic of deconstructivism, that you had, for instance, on a site very different conditions, a residential neighborhood right next to it, and then maybe a retail and an office, and then you maybe have a mixed-use condition where these things kind of clash on the site, and the different morphologies start to intersect, and that's in the discourse. When we moved to parametricism, we wanted to allow these differences to coexist, but then be more adapt to each other rather than being juxtaposed in stark contrast, disrupting each other, and looking more of a kind of morphing between different conditions, a gradual transformation of one to the other, or an overlap condition. These are interesting concepts for sure, and I also think what resonates with me is, or what I sometimes thought of, in a contemporary building you have not only determinate spaces, you also have zones which are left maybe vague. You can allow for degrees of indeterminacy, which allow for a kind of spontaneous appropriation. That's been in the discourse, and that's part of what I feel is important for that. It's sometimes interesting that it's kind of making strange and unsettling. So this is something which could be many things, and therefore could inspire new things. Of course, not in every room, not in every aspect, but that's something I'm also interested in. And so I think that's, for instance, this building we're talking about here is maybe has these two systems, a built form and the landscape form merging, but it's still, for my taste, relatively single system, single ontology. We're looking now more for projects which have more complexity, maybe more difference comes together, but of course we don't like this difference to just clash and become some kind of unresolved, menacing chaos, but something which is more varied and heterogeneous in its ingredients than this. There's an element. So the heuristics of positing conflicts and then see how these conflicts can be worked through into something which is maybe a symbiotic relationship, a morphing from one to the other, something which isn't just one thing violated through the presence of the other. And well, in terms of the form function, what I find interesting is the moment there, I mean, traditionally there has been this distinction in the field where those are, and the division of labor, which often led to kind of an oppositional relationship. So you have the American formalists, starting with people like Wittkower, who was interested in Palladian and symmetry and proportion, and to somebody like maybe Eisenman, Colin Rowe, Kipnis. And there is a defensiveness and a protection against having to deliver programmatic and functionality aspects, and I wanted to keep architecture more like a la pour la, like a design, like an art. That, which is in the final analysis indefensible, but as a temporary partial contribution, maybe a nearly necessary defense mechanism, because you cannot, a radical innovator like Eisenman in terms of formal potentials, he most probably had to reject addressing at the same time instrumentalizing all of this. It's maybe too much for somebody to cope with. So there's a defensive reaction to protecting, because he doesn't have functional answers. So he has to reject functionality at that point to allow that formal work to continue. And that's the way I understand this kind of nearly necessary false consciousness, to say, hey, we're in a post-functionalist world of architecture. Functionality isn't what the discipline should be about. I think this is a defense mechanism we have to theorize and not condone in the final analysis, because that would mean that the discipline is kind of suicidal trajectory, but as a partial trajectory, very important. On the other hand, you know, as I said earlier, there was this kind of the Dutch functionalists around Rem, and even earlier you had this division in modernism. You had the division between the IBC group and the radical functionalists, who didn't like the phrase modern architecture, because architecture still had the kind of flavor of having to do with form, proportion, with architectural values. They called it Neues Bauen, new building. They wanted us to be nearly like engineering. So you have these two groups, these two aspects in a division of labor confronting each other in some kind of misunderstanding and hostility. And for me, my project is trying to understand that you need research investigation on social programmatic issues, and that you had another group developing formal repertoires, but that at some point they have to come together and they have to combust into a new form-function correlation contribution. And that's been my task, and that was for me the founding moment of Design Research Lab 20 years ago. That was the programmatic agenda, where I used quite strategically the new open field-like single surface pulsating, swarming formal languages, which were a form of pure formalism, because somebody like Greg Lynn, Jesse Ryder, these characters come out of American formalism. And my agenda of saying, hey, I'm testing this now, I'm bringing this into congeniality with new forms of corporate structures, open network societal network organizations. We look at things like the Bürolandschaft, where you have already that open, flowy space, that field space. So that for me was an important element to bring these researchers together. At the same time, we need to keep distinguishing formal repertoires from functional conditions, because we need to remain agile in freely allowing the form to search for new functions it could do, because forms are ever versatile and maybe surprisingly détournement and refunctionalized into new conditions. And with respect to functions which have already traditional forms, they might look out for in the world of forms. So these domains remain always separate as conditions, and they're in the final real everyday delivery of a project, they always come together. But in the research arena, they can remain separate by two different investigators, and then there's maybe those who try in the middle, who are trying to research correlations. They're the ones then to bring this into reality. And I always thought also that design research that ties up with Zadid architects, we wanted to make this work real and potent and successful and moving from avant-garde to mainstream, which is when the avant-garde in Eisenman villa or house is just a manifesto project. It isn't, even if it's built, it is not, its purpose isn't to be the perfect home for somebody. It's a manifesto, similar to the Barcelona pavilion and these, which was never had a real function except of showing potentiality. So you have avant-garde research, avant-garde small manifesto building, but then if you look at this kind of project, it's still innovative, it's still radical, but it's delivering full-on, I think, functionality. This is 8 million visitors in the first year. Only the Louvre had, as a cultural destination in the world, had more visitors than this building in the same year. And the other project I show you in large mixed-use complexes in Beijing and Nanjing and other places. We're now doing airports, we're doing urban master plans. This is no longer manifesto, this is no longer muscle flexing. This is, in my view, tempting at least to deliver global best practice on a new level of performativity. Okay, you have to yet, it's difficult to appraise success and the contribution of the architecture to a success of an institution. That's always a difficulty, but that's the agenda. So that's where for these projects, trying to be interesting in terms of how we handle programs and which forms we use to handle these kind of contemporaneously interpreted programs. But I'm always happy and interested to learn from OMA and maybe Dilys Gafidio and such teams, the way they interpret briefs interesting, the way they program, the way they are innovative in terms of interpreting the life process. But then also drawing in all the formal repertoires which we have created and others. I mean, the big sponge drawing together into a synthesis, the resources from all the researchers and colleagues. And then you see it also, and it's interesting with Dilys Gafidio, they draw on formal resources which not necessarily have developed themselves. Sometimes they are kind of maybe criticized for this, but I think that's the right spirit. I think we should be in a spirit of forging projects by whatever means necessary. Yep.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. Picking up from that question, I want to ask a question about the problem of kind of radicality and innovation.
Yeah.
So you located innovation at the production of an expanded repertoire of forms.
Yeah.
But as critics might argue, as the buildings begin to deliver kind of consistency of kind of pliant, kind of bulbous forms, do you believe that Zaha Hadid Architects needs to innovate its kind of design method as well, the kind of rethinking of this process rather than always beginning with a form search, bend the form to match it? Do you think there's a need to kind of reinvent the process itself?
Well, yes, I most probably. I mean, what we have been doing is we're doing two things. We have a research group inside Design Architecture, which is called Code Computational Design, where we're trying to do what I hinted at with the phrase of tectonism, where we're trying to discipline the repertoires with a lot of playing with repertoires and formal systems by having already pre-constrained them with respect to certain technical conditions, which we for instance, we have a world of curved folding or curved origami when we created certain forms, which we know already it's only ruled surfaces. We can use it out of sheet material, and whatever we do now, we're playing degrees of freedom we have. It's always going to be translatable this way. Or if you look at Philip Block and Rhino Vault, where you shift around your spaces, and the vaulting which straps over this is always going to be compression only optimized. So this is one way of advancing this, which is different, which isn't operating here. In terms of, I'm not sure what you're hinting at, a totally radically different methodology. I don't know. I think we can't, I don't know how one would escape from a condition of having to make initial intuitive posits. You look at the project and you praise, how do I start? Is this going to be a kind of blob formation? Or is this going to be a voxel condition I start with? You can also have multiple ontologies at play. You can say I'm doing a continuous surface condition, and I'm kind of throwing voxels in, and then I have a kind of shell arrays operating at the same time. But these initial choices are, I don't know how you can ever not just intuitively posit them. So you have this a priori will always compromise that dream of an ultimate optimality, because that's arbitrary. So I don't see how you can ever go beyond, let's say, relatively arbitrary sort of choices. How you work away from arbitrariness, and then you start playing and you're pushing, you're trying to put in these constraints. And then it also matters which constraints come first. But of course, the real advance will come as you use computational power in, for instance, multi-objective evolutionary setups. But that's a lot of work, which you rarely do for an individual project. We're not there yet. But that's the avenue where you would set up, where you get downstream rationality on multiple objectives, multiple maybe ontologies at play, but you still can never overcome that initial positing of form to test. The way you do it, you sometimes have multiple teams starting. And the OMA tries sometimes to do it with a kind of so-called exhaustive catalog of options. This is also an illusion, because these catalogs are never exhaustive. And then when you kind of pick one out, you didn't have an exhaustive search. These are discussions of design process theory, which is in my book. I have a whole section on this, which it ties in with a lot of artificial intelligence. How do you develop search algorithms where you merge heuristics, which have a better chance to hit on solutions, etc. I don't know. I'm curious. I think it's a fascinating question, and I've written about it, but it's not something I can personally answer. But I think I was trying to ignite or find important to reignite actually a design methodology, design process theory, which was very big and emerged with somebody like Christopher Alexander in the late 50s, 60s into the 70s, while modernism was still there. All this collapsed with postmodernism. But I'm trying to hark back to this, and there was already so maybe that's what your question leads to, a kind of design process, rationality reflection, which I invite, which I'm dipping into but can't deliver towards any final comment. Yeah,
Do we have time? Oh, sorry.
yeah, go on. Absolutely, thanks.
Do we have time for one more? No.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one more.
So we all know that there's a pretty extensive legacy of architects dealing with the ideal body in their designs, especially Corbusier. But I was pretty troubled by the anatomical shock tactics that you employed of disfigured people, obviously, at their expense, in order to convince us that we should adhere to some sort of normative body beauty standard. I guess I'm wondering, given the legacies of, and the destructive legacies of ideologies that are based on ideal bodies, whether it's from, shaming of non-ideal bodies in the media to eugenics to colonialism, how is it defensible that architects are still fueling this idea of a body that is somehow more ideal than another body and basing architecture off that premise?
No, well, I think you're misinterpreting the intent, and the next image was also the historical transformation of ideals of beauty, so that they're historically specific, and I would also argue that they would be regionally specific. That in a contemporary society we have also various not. It is also, by the way, it was my real attempt was in the following image to look at ideals of beauty of built environments, or aesthetic appreciation, appeal, and repulse being feeling positive and negative, valency in various environments on an intuitive level. That's what I'm aiming at. So these images were only just to bring home that there is, in principle, through very graphic maybe example, a correlation between an aesthetic appreciation and an underlying performativity, and that in principle, although not infallibly, with inertia and the need for revolutionizing these sensibilities, that they mean something, that they are guiding aspect, the way we navigate the world, inevitably. Why? Because the complexity of situations and the necessity to relatively quickly appraise a situation, a person, an ambience, a milieu, that's we got to rely on this. But also, of course, it is prejudicial, but it is also has an information content with a probabilistic value for us, and we always have to rely on it in the built environment and also with respect to other people we encounter. We home in on some, and you're not coming to a party and literally going with a systematic checklist and going without prejudice to every one of them and have a series of check questions whether it's worthy to communicate with the person. You go by appearances, and that's but you also know that you can make mistakes and you can rely on it, and that maybe you also have to upgrade and learn to shift away from certain sensibilities and prejudices. That is my message in a nutshell. And what these images brought home, that there's a correlation and of course a tenuous one between appearances and what they deliver. And no, I don't think you can. Where you're taking the question isn't where I wanted to go. Yep. Yeah, I hear you.
You say offices like OMA sacrifice formal research for more programmatic interests.
Yeah.
What do you sacrifice for the sake of form?
Well, you can't do everything. That's true. I mean, I have to actually admit that. So we do less in querying of briefs and programmatic research in our computational projects. But at the same time, what I have invested in with respect to Design Research Lab and AA, looking very, very closely and intensely at a certain subdomain of programs, maybe, and that is the corporate organization, new work processes, new forms of productivity in corporate organization and workspaces, and I'm also invested in recently in urban research, agglomeration economies. Why mixity? What makes urban agglomerations function, and why are we living in that world of urban concentration? So I've done that outside that city office, and but I have to remind ourselves in terms of our DNA and culture, and I try to throw out slogans to us that take programs seriously. Each project should have a program innovation. Look at the way these guys, like people like OMA or maybe Big and Dilas Cafidio are inventive about the program conditions and program relations. So that's something which doesn't come natural to us as much. But I'm alerted to us, and I have to remind myself and my colleagues that we should try that more. So, but yeah, we can't do everything all the time equally in equally advanced ways. So that's why we also, I think, need to learn from each other across the spectrum of innovators, let's say. Thanks for the question.
Hi, Patrick. I was interested in that slide that had the iteration of form and function to architecture versus society.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of this city beautiful plan they had at the early 20th century, where they really tried to think a lot more about aesthetics in the city planning of cities like Chicago after the World Expo and stuff like that. And these cities, a lot of these districts became kind of unused or underused, and some have even a lot of high crime rates now because, as you've shown with those slides, inevitably styles, taste changes. So just as it does with the body, what do you think will happen to the perception of your work after the architectural taste changes in the coming years?
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, the City Beautiful movement and these kind of designs for Chicago, I think, looking back, they were already out of date and anachronistic at the time they were proposed, I believe. Because they were based on, let's say, the Baroque city, which was a city of what I call the mercantilist absolute state, where you had still something like a quasi-planned economy with a very, very strong state allocating parts of the economy to various monopolies and privileged groups, and able to design that city a bit like in one kind of centrally controlled way. That wasn't the way the 20th century was able to organize it. It had to be something much more dynamic, much more polycentric, much more with multiple actors operating simultaneously, something, you know, that Chicago then became or what Manhattan becomes. I mean, so that was already false to begin with, and that's why it was a dead letter. And you know, you can the next stage. I think that in the mid 20th century, from the 1920s onwards, you had this kind of era of Fordist mass reproduction, where you have the suburbanization process at the same time spreading out, and now you have the reconcentration and intensification. So the shift from modernism into postmodernism and deconstructivism, and then even into Pragmatism, is that shift from Fordism to post-Fordism, from the mid-20th century into the late 20th century and 21st century. And so that, and there's a number of attempts to articulate that and get architecture and urbanism ready for that. So I see that, for instance, postmodernism, deconstructivism, Pragmatism try to solve the same problem, which is to articulate that new, concentrated, layeredness, complexity, dynamism of the city. And I think deconstructivism was picking up on a lot of the progressive features of postmodernism, but got rid of its irrelevant historical motifs to create what Jenks called postmodern space, which was already intersecting, collaging, aggregating. And I think that, so deconism is a better version of this, and I think Pragmatism is an even better version of this, because I think what deconstructivism delivers, if you go on with layering and collaging these projects on top of each other, next to each other, you end up with this kind of, what we have now, this identityless, menacing visual chaos, what I call garbage spill urbanization. That's in a sense been aestheticized by deconstructivism, and deconstructivism would deliver like this in an intensified way. And I think Pragmatism is an attempt to say, hey, can we cope with that non-planned, bottom-up dynamism of agglomeration, and yet forge urban identities in a bottom-up, path-dependent way, like an ecology of species, which interact and resonate and always build and develop legible organizations like a natural environment. That's my perspective of Pragmatism. Still trying exactly the same thing. How can we articulate the intense, interconnected agglomeration? But now we know that we're not just agglomerating to be next to each other, we're agglomerating to network and be with each other, connect and cooperate with each other. And if the developer comes in and builds on a certain site, he selects the site and puts a particular mixed use there because of neighboring conditions which he is interacting with and becomes synergetic with. And these synergies and associations and connections should be articulated, and that's the ethos and promise of Pragmatism, which deconstructivism can't do, postmodernism couldn't do. Now, this is a very, very open stylistic project, which could have multiple stages and phases and could go on for another 50, 60, I don't know, years. It's a bit like modernism. Modernism had multiple stages and subsidiary styles and was going on for 70 years. Homo and Decon was only a decade or so each, because for me they're transitional styles, a little bit like Art Nouveau and Expressionism was from the transition from historical architecture and modernism. So I think I can't tell you what's coming next. I just have the conviction somehow that the methodologies and repertoires and principles of Pragmatism, because they're quite open, but they have the right congenial sort of principles, differentiation, resonating, adaptation, also local and regional adaptation, that they would be robust for, certainly during my lifetime. So I don't expect that there is something quite radically different, another epochal shift around the corner. And that isn't something which the discipline can create of its own resources. I mean, I think what Pragmatism does, and it's something quite open and an open invitation with very, very general and abstract principles, is, I think, the answer of architecture to the, let's say, computationally empowered post-Formalism network society. And to expect another stylistic shift would only be credible, would only make sense if you had another radical epochal shift in the way civilization functions. And I don't know if that's coming. The big shift which delivered what I call post-Formalism network society was the microelectronic revolution as a total new kind of paradigm compared to the mechanical mass reproduction which modernism is based on. So you need something very quite radical, which shows a lot of also socioeconomic implication and technological potentials to justify or to call forth another epochal shift in styles. I don't know when this is coming. Maybe it is, if we really would reach that point, which I don't see, for instance, that we don't have to have the reliance on that interface, face-to-face interaction, which now I think it's, even though we have mobile phones and internet and so on, the pulling together in face-to-face interaction, in close concentration and proximity, it's still been the principle for the last decades and decades to come. If somebody says this is no longer necessary, that this could substitute for, and I don't see it, because if you work in the real world, it's not only here that the way we can interact, but you have these meetings on projects with 30 consultants in face-to-face interactions. Each project, each aspect. I mean, for me, it's important how you actually producing prosperity. That while they are still checking their email, you have this kind of workshops together, and you need to all be there and break down in small groups and discuss, and everybody's listening to an overall condition. That's I think the network society. And then as you've been in these meetings, and then you step out and the communications continue, and then you go to the barbecue to look at the next exhibition, then you go to the A for the lecture, so that the next morning you already recalibrated with new inputs how to tackle the problem you're working on. So you need to work in that network 24/7 synergy, which is a lot to do with direct proximity, while of course you're at the same time. But oftentimes I go a lot online, but oftentimes it's also in a conversation, in a lecture. That's where you find out what to search online. So I think if that condition for me delivers, it's parametricism, and I don't know when this will stop. When this stops, or when suddenly we could be totally remote, then yes, everything radically changes. I don't know if somebody should now prepare for this, and if that comes, when this comes, I don't know. So that is, so for me, I always say I'm totally agnostic with respect to when this stops, when there will be another aesthetic and stylistic revolution. I know it will be, eventually, must be. I mean, it's not deluding myself that this isn't coming, but I don't know when, and I have no idea in what direction then we would move. And it certainly must have very, very strong technological, socioeconomic motivation. It's not something we initiate. We're only reacting to a kind of transformed world with a new style, I would argue. Shall we leave it at that? Okay. Right.